So in this workshop, we're going to deal with a matter that NARSOL has not really focused on all that much, and yet it is a critical issue facing our movement and the lives of an awful lot of people. We're fortunate to have two folks who have really looked into this and have worked closely with guys that are in civil commitment. Trevor Hoppe, who will be the first presenter, is Assistant Professor of Sociology at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. His research examines the social control of sexuality by institutions of law, public health, and medicine. He is the author of the Lambda Literary Award-winning book, Punishing Disease, HIV, and the Criminalization of Sickness. That book tracks the rise and application of HIV-specific criminal statutes in the United States, demonstrating how fear and stigma mixed with homophobia, racism, and anti-sex work ideologies create the perfect storm for HIV criminalization. And of course, many of us remember that especially 10-year episode or more in the 1980s and early 90s, and how they affected everyone in the country at that time. He is also the co-editor with David Halperin of the book The War on Sex, which examines the rise of punitive policies towards sex. So we're very happy to have Trevor with us today. We're very fortunate that he's joining us. Christian Doggett was born in Texas. He was charged with sexual assault in 1991 for an intimate relationship with his girlfriend, and received deferred adjudication and probation. 5 years later, he was told he had to register in Texas. He moved to Minnesota, where he did not have to register. In Minnesota, he held many federal and state jobs and was a member of the Air Force Reserves. Christopher has 4 daughters. He started the NARSOL affiliate in Minnesota called Minnesota for Our Rights. Today, he is an industrial toxicologist for the state of Minnesota and advocates on behalf of those civilly committed at the Moose Lake facility, which I assume some of you have heard about, with the incredible developments going on there. So please welcome our two guests, Trevor Hoppe and Christopher Doggett.
Waiting for that one, we'll switch to this one. Just to sort of get a read of the room, how many folks before coming here today have never heard of civil commitment? A handful of folks. Okay, so I'm going to walk through the research side of things and talk about the work that I've been doing recently on issues related to kind of who's being affected. A lot of these facilities are kind of black boxes where people get sent, and then states hide behind HIPAA policies to basically say, we're not going to tell you who's here. It's a medical treatment that's being offered. You'll hear more about that in a second. Basically, you're set to get out of prison or jail, any kind of confinement for, usually on the basis of being convicted of a sex offense. Minnesota is a little different. You'll hear about that more. Most states, 20 states have these programs and the federal government. you're about to get out of prison, the state decides, actually, we'd like to keep you longer than your prison sentence, we're going to transfer you to this treatment facility, and we'll keep you here until we think you're ready to be released, which is often never. And so that's the sort of race through just the idea of what these facilities are. And you're going to hear more from Christian, who's doing more of the kind of advocacy side of things about sort of the ins and outs and problematics of these programs. For me, I was trying to get a sense, starting this new work on this issue, like Paul said, I had worked on HIV laws before this. I didn't know anything about civil commitment laws. I think many Americans are not aware that this program exists at all. And it was really hard to find basic information, like how many people. Just even answering that question, there was no easy answer. And then just sort of demographically thinking about who's in these facilities and does it match other patterns in the criminal justice system in terms of racial justice issues and disproportionate impacts on people of color. So that's the kind of, what I'm going to sort of run through here. Where does the data come from? If you're curious, we can talk more about it in the Q&A, but I'm just briefly describe that it comes from public records requests alongside existing program surveys that are out there from the Sex Offender Civil Commitment Program Network does a survey of these facilities, and we use some of their data, along with data that we scraped from public sex offense registries from the internet. As I said, there are 20 states and the federal government. North Carolina, where we are, does not have civil commitment, although we are home to the federal civil commitment facility, not terribly far from here. But this state in and of itself doesn't. You're going to hear a lot about Minnesota in particular. My work is now focusing mostly on Florida, but nationally is what I'm going to be talking about today in terms of data. So based on our findings, this is from a Williams Institute report. It's public and freely accessible. If you just Google Williams Institute Civil Commitment, you'll find the report. You can read in more detail all the various findings. In 2018, we found that there were 6,351 people in these facilities presently. Of course, that doesn't account for people who either have died in these facilities, which is not a small number, or people who have been let out. And as you'll hear, Minnesota tends not to let folks out often. Some states, it is a little more common than in Minnesota, so there is variation in that. So many more people than 6,300 people have been affected by this since these programs were implemented in the 90s, mostly in 2000s. The largest facilities, some of this would be expected. California is, of course, a very large state. It has the largest facility. Minnesota is obviously not the second largest state in the United States by population. It has a much higher number of detainees than you would expect. And again, I think you'll hear more about that and why that might be from Christian. Florida, and then Illinois and New Jersey make up, have quite large facilities. I'm looking at Florida specifically in my work. This is just sort of a map showing you where those kind of, the size of those facilities. New York, 380, largest out in California. So this research on racial inequality, are people of color, particularly African Americans, overrepresented in the civilly committed population? It was possible to do this analysis in 12 states. Not every state provided demographic information on people who were detained in these facilities. That's why it's not possible in the other states. And in 10 out of 12 of the states, we found that black residents faced a greater rate of civil commitment than whites. On average, the rate of commitment per 100,000 adults, almost 8 for black residents, less than half that, about 3.11 for white folks. So more than double the rate among African Americans. And Hispanics, Hispanic residents would be at a lower representation, 1.12. And so, if we're interested in talking about what could be driving some of these, that would be something to talk about in the Q&A for sure. Because all we're seeing and describing right now is the trends, and then we want to think about what are the causes, right? And I think that's hopefully future research will kind of look at that more closely. Looking at the black to white ratio, New Jersey has the most disproportionately black population. This mirrors some trends in criminal justice more generally. Virginia, Nebraska, Illinois, and then you have a state like Pennsylvania, which is in the inverse trend, which is whites are higher than African Americans in that state. And Pennsylvania's facility is a little different, and there's probably explanations for that. But generally, the trend is that there are higher rates. So that finding is pretty consistent across all states that have these programs. It's a little harder to ask the question about sexual orientation because obviously no state asks that of people being incarcerated or people in these facilities. So we don't really have an easy, obvious measure for how to evaluate the sexual orientation of these detainees. And so the way that we do that is we use a proxy variable, which is victim gender. And understandably, that's not perfect, right? We get that that is not a parallel to sexual orientation, but it's the only thing we kind of can work with because there's lots of anecdotal evidence that particularly gay men are much more likely to be in commitment than you would expect given the proportion of the population. So we really wanted to look at this question. We could only do this in New York and Texas because those are the two states that provide and include victim gender data in the sex offense registry that's public. And so those are the two states that we look at. But the finding is consistent across both of them, which is that about 1 in 3 of people civilly committed are people who were convicted of offenses with same-sex partners. So we say here MSM, men who have sex with men. That's not the same as sexual orientation, but it's as close as we're going to get. So that's compared to about 1 in 8 of people on the registry. So that's a pretty big disparity to go from 12% to 33% in civil commitment. And it's basically the same trend in Texas. About 10% on the registry are people convicted with same-sex offenses in that state versus almost a third of people who are in commitment. When we look at race crossed with this finding about victim gender and inferring sexual orientation, there's some variation, black, white, Hispanic, but the trend is the same, which is there are higher rates of civilly committed people who were convicted of same-sex offenses, offenses with same-sex victims as compared to the registry. Much higher differences among white detainees. And so again, I think there's a lot of room to kind of follow up here with research and advocacy to try to understand what's going on here. Texas, basically the same trend. But you can see in Texas, 41% of civilly committed persons there are people who are men who have sex with men. And that's obviously a vastly disproportionate impact for white folks in that state. And anecdotally, people that we're going to hear from later in the Moose Lake facility in Minnesota say that these trends are consistent with what they see in that state. What are the causes? I can only speculate here, right? We're just at the beginning of this research, but one cause could be the Static 99, which is an instrument that's used to evaluate potential candidates for civil commitment, alongside other instruments as well. But a lot of states use this in some capacity, and you may be familiar with this measure, and one of the variables that they include on this scoring sheet is whether there were any male victims. And if you have, if you answer yes to that, you're automatically assigned a point, and more points means, a higher score, which is interpreted as a better candidate for commitment. So there's kind of a baked-in homophobic standard there. And because no women, I think there's maybe I've seen maybe 1 or 2 cases of commitment involving women detainees. We're not talking about 50% men, 50% women answering this question. It's 99.999% men answering this question. So it's necessarily homophobic to include that. So that coding is one possible mechanism. There are also other ones. You have to be accused of having a personality disorder or a mental abnormality. I use those terms because that's what's under the law. I don't use them to represent that that's a real medical category. They're not medical categories. They're invented by lawmakers. They're pseudoscientific, and they can include a large variety of quote-unquote conditions or things. And when you have a mostly heterosexual population evaluating the sexuality of sexual minorities, we wonder and speculate whether you're more likely to be seen as deviant and find labels to cast you as deviant. And one way that they do that is this paraphilia not otherwise specified category, which is not a proper medical diagnosis, obviously, but it is one that can be used to justify commitment. And so again, I think there's a lot of room for research and advocacy on that, the use of these kinds of pseudo-medical labels. And it's worth noting the APA is very against these kinds of practice. They've come out very strongly against civil commitment. And again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So, just sort of on its face, what are those key findings? Over 6,000 people currently detained in 2018, much higher rates among black men and much higher rates among MSM. This recently came up in the Ketanji Jackson Supreme Court discussion. Dear Senator Ted Cruz used it as a cudgel to kind of attack Justice Jackson. And that was kind of it. It's first time I've been cited by a senator, so I'll take that as a compliment, I guess. Obviously, we see differently on this issue, but I think it suggests that at least this issue is, people are aware that this is happening more than has been in the past. So that's, I think, good to at least have a good public discussion about whether this is an appropriate use of resources and whether this is, effective or just. Lots of questions you can ask about these facilities. If you want to read that report again, it's public, free, easily available, much more sort of dig down into the data. Feel free to email me, tweet at me, all things. The way it will work now is I'm going to turn it over to Christian to hear about more of the kind of advocacy side, particularly from Minnesota. And in a little bit, we're going to have our phones ring. Don't be alarmed if we pick up the phone. It's because we have people calling us who are in commitment in the Moose Lake facility, and we're going to hear from them as well. We're really excited to be able to do that today. So please bear with us. If there are tech challenges, we tested it earlier. We should be good to go. But with further ado, I'll turn it over now to Christian.
Oh, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Kind of sound funny when I listen to myself talk. I always hate that. I had a professor in college, communication professor, and he mentioned to me, he said, anytime you're in front of a bunch of people, you're supposed to vision them in their underwear. But I can't do that because what if I take a polygraph and fail next week? I'm screwed. So no, vision anybody in their underwear. I promise. Well, as Trevor had spoken about some statistics about civil commitment, so you get civilly committed, now what? Now you're stuck. What's the outlet? What's the help? What do we do? So I have to commend Daniel and Russell, the two people that actually started this movement called Ocean. Kind of had a strange phone call probably about 9 months ago. I don't know how he got my name, but I answered the phone and the gentleman said, I think I forgot how it said. It said, somebody, Daniel calling you from the Moose Lake Treatment Facility Center. And I thought, what's this? Okay. So I answer it and I talked to Daniel and he said, are you Christian? And we developed a pretty good relationship. So 9 months later, here we are right now talking about civil commitment. And this is what it is. So two people, Russell and Daniel, they started this group called Ocean. And as you can kind of see, Ocean, what does it stand for? Well, overcoming corruption and empowering all nations. If you call them an organization, they'll kind of get a little bit, they don't want to call it an organization. They want to call it a movement. It's a movement to push out, not an agenda that's a negative agenda, but pushing out civil commitment, not necessarily just about Minnesota, but everywhere. What is civil commitment? And like I said, you're stuck. You're there, and there's no outlet, and it's kind of a sad thing to go through. But just to kind of go through a little bit about Ocean, strive not to overcome the corruption around them, is doing so to empower others, despite cultural differences, to also overcome corruption. It's a motivator. Ocean is a motivator for the detained, keeping them grounded into the spirit that will ultimately end corruption and specifically in sexual violent predator commitment and so forth. So the truths about this. So this was kind of, I was on the plane and I was talking to the fiance, and I was kind of going through this, and it was kind of a struggle. But I kind of got it. It kind of just finally clicked in my head. So those who support civil commitment, whether they are aware of it or not, are they supporting sexual violence? Because if you think about it, civil commitment does nothing to prevent sexual violence, does it? If we want to go back to prevention, well, that's prevention. But you're detained. What are you doing to actually prevent any of this from happening? Not. How about this one for, again, Trevor had mentioned 20 states have civil commitment and 30 states don't. Well, how about the states that have civil commitment have more recidivism and more offenses than the ones that don't? That should open up your eyes. Why is that? We pour so much money into this, into these programs, and it really doesn't do anything. So, to abolish civil commitment, what was the First Amendment and the right and what they wanted to do? They wanted to create a Facebook page, which they successfully did. It's really good, and there's another group that kind of catches, it's kind of I call it a sister group called End MSOP. So create a Facebook page, right? Then you organize and demonstrate, and then you, well, let's take it back. Once they organized this group and they became a group and they had participants in Moose Lake to kind of come together, which is very difficult to do, and I'll kind of catch on that in just a minute. They organized a demonstration. So they had 2 hunger strikes. And has anybody ever heard of the hunger strikes that happened last year? They had 2. The first one was 40 participants that did this. The second was 120. They did this for 14 days. Several ended up in the hospital. I think they did open up the eyes to some of the legislators, but after that it just kind of dies down and just kind of, just a twinkle in the eye, and nobody really cares about it too much anymore, especially what the legislators really think about. So, but they're busy. He's very busy in there. He does 36 articles. He does it in like a 12-month period. He continuously writes articles. He gets it out there. He moves it. He comes to me, and I put it out on Facebook, and I think in MSOP and some other groups. But also, it's interesting because some of the articles had reached overseas, Germany, Vietnam, and some other countries. So it's getting movement, and it's getting more successful. Launching a project to create an alliance with existing prevention programs at work. Minnesota Department of Health has a sexual assault prevention. I get the quarterly meetings and I get the invites, and they talk about prevention and what's preventing, but how do you prevent? Do you prevent the people that may have been abused as a child, and then you want to stop that, or you want to identify that, and how do you do that? And how do you really prevent? It's a tough question, but they do have prevention programs out there, but they don't seem to share those a lot. They seem to share that civil commitment has created this safety net in the state, and that we really lock up violent people, and then, hey, we're okay, we're a safer community. But that's not necessarily true. A little bit about Russell and Daniel. So, Russell, and I believe Russell has been there, I think he's been there for about 16 years. Russell's been there for quite a long time. So Russell's only, his non-treatment participant was a non-juvenile offender to gain CPS status. He did that by focusing on some misdiagnosis, which we often do when we say we're mentally ill and they just misdiagnose, and then that kind of just creates the wrong signal, and then again the wrong image of somebody. But interesting, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it clear that they must have a mental disorder to justify civil commitment. Do we know that? I didn't even know that. So if I have to have a clear and justification to civilly commit me, you know, that's interesting because they say you have to be mentally ill, right, in order to be civilly committed. So I don't necessarily believe that's even true in some of the cases of some of these people. So it's just unfortunate. And by the way, not every one of these people in Moose Lake or St. Peter, there's one of two locations. Moose Lake in the northern part has more people in civil commitment than St. Peter. There's a percentage of them that don't even have any sexual crimes at all. Some are just have some sort of the kind of mental illness, some other factors that may be involved. And there's some cases of people that have been in there longer that haven't even, they've witnessed some crimes as a child and then coming up to a juvenile, and the state thought it would be better to civilly commit them because they forecast that they may be committing crimes in the future, so they civilly commit them. Case in point, there's a gentleman in there who's been there for 35 years or so, and guess what? All he did was witness his, I think, his stepdad from taking his mother's life, and then the court thought, this guy is going to be a danger, so let's get him in civil commitment. He's been there ever since. That's disheartening when we think about our society and we think about that. So, educate. You know, we always think, and when I got myself in trouble when I was 18, this is way back in 1990. So I think about the courts. I think the courts are the way to go. But a lot of people think, no, education is the way to go. And if we educate on the right data or the right statistics, I think that maybe, does that make anybody feel more comfortable? You know, my job has a lot to do with data and statistics. And then just kind of give you an example of, say, if you're exposed to asbestos and you know, you have a high number percentage, then, oh, well, the data shows that you are exposed to this versus a lower percentage, then, oh, well, I guess I'm not, I'm okay. But statistics and data have a lot to do with this, but does it really reflect the actual truth or really the actual data? So one thing I got to talk about is this real quick, is Daniel and Russell. This is a very, very sad thing, and I have to get my notes here. So, get this. Just to talk about this in civil commitment, to talk about ocean, to talk about the unjust laws, I think that that are being broken here, they get 1 week of punishment to just stay in the room, to talk about it. Just to mention to somebody, to say, hey, John, you ever heard about ocean? We've got some resources out there that people can help us, but no. 1 week to be placed in your room. If you organize anything, meetings, groups, brochures, anything, you get locked up in a solitary confinement, such as prison. There's 3 levels. It's called Omega. And you can be up there up to 3 months with no contact, with nothing. So for these guys to create a movement and to create something that they have to take a risk for, they took a stand. These 2 gentlemen really took a stand to push this out there, and I was aware of it, and I made a lot of people aware of this as well, too. So this is, I commend and respect these guys to go through that. It's pretty tough. Create a network. That has got to be tough. To create a network, to start from the ground up inside civil commitment with a 15-minute phone call, right? Or a letter for your mom and dad to push out to this, to talk to the neighbors, to talk to this, to talk to this. Now they have MSOP, which is another group, and they have weekly meetings. We had Metropolitan State University in St. Paul come together, and we talked about this with Eric Janis and Mitchell Hamlin School of Law and the Sex Offender Litigation Policy Center. We've had movements. We've had people identify and understand civil commitment process, and these guys have come together, and it's fascinating. I was on the video with those guys. I'm on the video with the MNSOP usually every other week and so forth like that. But to create a network, to share your same goals, to communicate and to get things out quickly, and that's one thing about social media I have to say is there's a story I'll have to just quickly tell you. In 1983, it took 40 hours for us to get the kind of information we do today. In the same time, we can get the information in 5 minutes. You create an article, you get it pushed, you get it sent, you scan it, you email it, you put it on social media. That gets out quickly. So that's something they have to keep doing. They have to keep pushing this movement. Contact elected officials. Some elected officials will certainly are on board with this, but when it comes time to creating a bill and to move forward, they usually shy away from this. So it is very difficult to kind of go through to contact the legislators. So, but they do, and there's a few of them that have certainly spoke up. And there's one that actually went to go visit Moose Lake a few weeks ago, and he was very vocal about it. We get movement on that, and I think there's going to be much more persistence. That's something else. Even with my group in here I'm going, Minnesota for Rights, I can really tackle it for 1 week, really hard, and the next week I'm just like, I don't want to do anything about it, and the next week I'm up and I'm up and down, because I'm a free person in society. I got a job, I got this, I got kids. So, but these guys have to be persistent, day in and day out, consistently. And they would have not gotten where they are today if they weren't persistent and to keep pushing this. So that is something that you have to be strong-willed and in order for you to get that message out. Practice compassion. That is also something that's pretty tough as well. But everybody in there, well, they probably are practicing compassion with each other, and I'm compassionate in their issues as well. So that is something that I think is a necessary. Hold detainees accountable. What does that mean, detainees accountable? We can't call them prisoners, so you call them detainees. Well, to me it's the same word. I mean, it's just how the legislation and how the people use that word. But they urge them. You got to urge other people. Some people in civil commitment are like, I don't care, I'm here forever, this is it, I'm going to die. And then there's some people that are like, yeah, I'm interested in this, and I want to push this, and I want to talk to my family members, but I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get written up, I'm going to put in solitary confinement, and then I won't talk to anybody for 3 months, up to 3 months. Take a stand. So hold them accountable and urge them as well. The big picture, thinking. Be cautious about spending too much time and too many resources on one detainee unless it sheds light on the bigger issue. That's also something as well. Russell, here's what I was going to say. I got my notes mixed up. So Russell, he's been there for 16 years. He is one of the co-founders of Ocean, and I think he's bringing light not only to the society, but exhibits for victims of sexual violence. But of course, money is being wasted on this, and it could be used to serve victims of sexual violence. State of Minnesota has, per inmate, I think it costs $22,000 a year per inmate for Minnesota Department of Corrections. That's in the prisons. It's $100,000 per person in civil commitment. A little bit over. And you got 740 people in 2 facilities. So how much money are we wasting on this when it could go back to prevention? Daniel's attitude is like Super Bowl. He kind of thinks that this is achieving for us to make it this far, but Daniel has a little bit of a driven foundation of faith, and I think has brought this to his attention that this is not, I'm not giving up here. This is my fight, and I'm going to continue to keep going and keep fighting. So he's going to be a pillar for this. And as history sometimes repeats itself, hey, we may see articles and books and things written about Daniel 30 years from now about what he did and what he overcome. Well, the current open projects right now, there's a lot that Minnesota is going through and a lot that Ocean is doing. So Civil commitment is less than 1% effective in preventing sexual violence. Therefore, in 2022, Ocean challenged the top highest paid MSOP employees to donate money to effective sexual assault preventive programs. The two top people are making a couple $100,000 a year. But no, they didn't take the challenge, they didn't do it, and that probably tells them that they're maybe not looking for prevention. They get paid very well to manage the program or not to manage the program. So the Accountability Project, every time detainees witness staff doing unethical, it's recorded and posted online. Can I tell you how many people or how many, I've heard recordings of a few. There's staff that have told these detainees, people in civil commitment, it's better to take your life than to sit here and waste our time. That has been recorded. It's also been recorded, if you go through it, it's very, I'm a state employee, so hey. But I can tell you, there's a lot of people that have been fired and disciplined for treatment or misuse and other allegations against people in civil commitment too. It's pretty high. There's a lot of numbers. There's a lot of high turnover rate. One other thing I want to tell about, it's not on here, but this is sad. If you go through a program and you're there and you'll say 3 years that we can work yourself out, but there's a high number of psychologists and psychiatrists that quit. They come in there, they quit. If you get to a point and you're at 2-3 years and you're doing great and that individual employee quits, you start all over from ground one, day one. And there's many people that have quit. And then you're talking 15 or 20 years that you have to start all over. That's unbearable. Most states will civil commitment require that a person have a sex offense. Not the case in Minnesota. All states, civil commitment and definition is preventative detention, meaning that the state locks people up to prevent them from committing crimes. Kind of reminds me of that movie, Minority Report, with Tom Cruise about, can I forecast that you're going to commit another crime? No, not necessarily. In Minnesota, 2 allegations of emotionally and harmful conduct is enough to commit someone. In Minnesota, there's no need to prove that a person has an inability to control his or her own sexual impulses. In Minnesota, over 90 detainees have died attempting to complete their program. Over 650 are juvenile offenders, and over 90 are over the age of 65. That is a pretty high number. 92 people as of right. Actually, no. The new number as of last week is 93 people have passed away. I just got that number today from Daniel. So, to get involved with Ocean, I've got some PowerPoint. I've got the PowerPoints and I've got some brochures if you guys want to, if you want to have this as a civil commitment pamphlet, and there's some other things on how to start a movement from inside a shadow prison. There's a couple of them down there. They're really great information. Talks about some laws and what they go through. So, in that is really it of what all I have to say. But I will say this. When I say that anybody can be civilly committed in Minnesota, you can. You don't have to, it doesn't have to take for a process. Somebody has to make a phone call to the to the human service. They can conduct an investigation. They can determine whether or not that you fit this criteria and you can be civilly committed. That right there, enough, is horrible for itself. In fact, last night we had such a bad rainstorm, I made the lovely woman go get the umbrella so I wouldn't get my hair wet. She probably can have me civilly committed. But bad joke, I'm sorry. We had to lighten up the crowd here, please. But that's it. But thank you so much for your time.
Hey, Russ. 1 second. Do we have Christian yet?
Daniel.
All right. Russ, Daniel's going to get started, but I'll hold you up to the speaker so you can hear him, and then we'll turn it over to you. That sound good? Remember, you have to hold it up to this mic.
Hey, Daniel? Daniel? Okay, hold on. Daniel is on the phone. If anybody has any questions at all, he can certainly help answer those questions.
Well, I think Daniel has something to say.
Daniel, if you have something to say, I'm going to go ahead and put you on the mic. Here you go. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for everybody that showed up, and thank you for showing an interest in civil commitment issues. NARSOL has been a huge inspiration for us and a lot of guys that are detained here. And, we just felt like it was time to really kind of create some awareness around this issue. I've been here 5 years. I've witnessed 32 deaths in that 5 years. And I've witnessed, thank God, I've witnessed 16 releases. But before I got here, there was never a release. In the first 25 years, there was never a release from the facility. So we just had to watch our friend Nathan pass away recently, and watching those deaths was a big motivator for us to speak up and start trying to do something. And my friend Russell and I have really just poured our hearts into this cause. And when we first met, and I want to make this clear because this is very important to us, that the first thing that we talked about was whether or not this was really preventing sexual violence, because that was the claim. That's the claim by the state, and every civil commitment state that has a program similar to this will make the claim that it's preventing sexual violence. But there's been multiple studies on that. It's not true. There's 20 states that have civil commitment, and our recidivism levels are not lower, they're higher. So there may be some indirect cause where maybe we're spending the money in the wrong place. And if we spend money on programs that are proven to work, we may actually be able to lower sexual assault numbers in our state. And that's really at the heart of Ocean and what we're really trying to do. So this isn't just about us going home. It's about doing the right thing. And if it's not working, it needs to change. And civil commitment doesn't work. That's why 30 states don't do it. There's a reason for that. So without me getting into a bunch of rambling, I really want Russell to talk about how he was able to motivate this population. When me and him met up, we kind of just had to capitalize on our own strengths. And something I focused on was trying to build a network outside of the facility, find support, find people that will help us, that will listen to our purpose and just support us. And he focused inward. He focused on our peers, the men inside the facility. And what he was able to do and the results that he got is really fabulous. I just can't say enough about what Russell was able to do. So I want him to talk a little bit about that. And again, thank you to everybody. So I don't know if Russ can hear me. Maybe you want to introduce him, but thanks to everybody.
Russ, could you hear that at all?
Yeah, I can hear just fine.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you now. I'm putting you up to the microphone now. Oh.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. I have to mute myself anyways. Yeah, go ahead.
Alright. So like Daniel said, I want to thank everyone who's shown interest in this. We take it as a serious issue that we're raising. One of the things I looked at myself, I'm First Nation Anishinaabe, and one of our things is we always look out for other people who are seen as have disabilities. Part of my traditions is that we humble ourselves and we see ourselves as equal. So if someone has like a more capability to assist other people, we take that role on. Like at our powwows, when we dance for people who aren't able to dance, and we sing, we help lift people up. And I've been in this program going on 15 years, and I've witnessed a lot of horrible tragedies. And
one of the biggest things is that we're sent here supposedly for a mental illness, a serious mental illness, and we're supposed to be receiving treatment. But in the 15 years that I've been here, I haven't witnessed that personally. And I've really struggled with that because the courts had told me at the initial of my commitment that it would take me 3 years to get to this program and I'd be released back out into society and reunited with my family and my community and start working on repairing the harms that I've caused. So realizing the hopelessness and the helplessness of this facility and the population, I started looking at, all right, what can I do to better my community within an institutional setting? And I started studying psychology. I got certified as a drug and alcohol treatment specialist. I started working with men individually and in the group setting. I had participated in a treatment program for the first 5 years from 2007 2013. In 2013, I rescinded my consent and started pursuing cognitive neuroscience and psychology on my own. I started reaching out to members in the community, to professors, mental health advocates, everyone I could reach out to. I wrote thousands of letters since I've been here and trying to seek support and gain awareness to what's been going on here. I think it was 2010, 2011, the Carson's case went into effect, and I could see that there was a glimmer of hope for men in the population that maybe there was a door going to be opening up from the Carson's lawsuit. And like, I think almost 10 years later, or maybe a little less than that, the Carson's case was granted, it was affirmed by Donovan Frank that the program was unconstitutional. And my understanding of psychology, I started watching people's behaviors and attitudes and motivations, and I could see that their spirits were being uplifted because here we had this opportunity that we were finally going to be getting released. Later on the road, the Carson's case overturned in 8th Circuit, and I again started observing the population, and I seen how when the 8th Circuit ruled it overturned the Carson's case and said that the program was not unconstitutional, I seen how the spirits and everything of the population just dropped. I seen guys starting to isolate, starting to get involved in things that would be considered like high-risk behaviors, all these things that really caused guys to pull back in, I guess, the hope that they had. So what I did is I started working with another peer over in another unit. His name is Lincoln Brown, and I wanted to understand, or I wanted to try to instill some hope in this population. So I put on what we called a cultural event, and it was a 2-day event, and I did it for 2 years, one right after another, where I put on, I asked all the guys that are involved in their religions to get involved, share their information about what their culture means to them. And to me, culture goes beyond just my religious belief or spiritual beliefs. It's much broader aspect of who we are as individuals. And the intent was to inspire some hope, because we're all in here and we're all experiencing the same struggle of not knowing when we're going to get out, not knowing when we're going to see our families again. I took that concept with the cultural event, and when the COVID pandemic hit, we were all confined to our cell blocks, to our units, and I live on a 98-man unit, and there's other units, like Daniel's unit is about a 60-man unit. And on a 98-man unit, they had locked us down throughout the facility, and we couldn't go out the unit. Everything was being done on our individual cell blocks. So I got together with another man on Unit 1E, and I said, why don't we take the cultural concept, the cultural connection concept, and do it smaller, but on our unit. So we took that and, again, try to inspire some hope. And at the same time, myself and the legal-minded guys on this unit were studying the DSM-5 peer reviews that were written by Richard Wohler, Alan Francis, and some of the top leading professionals who have authored the DSM-5 or authored previous DSMs. And we had spent a whole year during this COVID lockdown studying this research. And when we put this event on for the small community over here on 1E, our intent was to educate the population, or at least the guys on 1E, about why they're here, why the courts have determined that they have these severe mental illnesses, and to start questioning their primary therapist about, all right, the court has said that I had this severe mental illness. There's criteria that need to be met in order to say I had this severe disorder. There's the impairment concept, and there's all these other medical terms that are applied. And myself, Michael Benson, Jacob Flom, and a few other individuals, we put on this we called it a unity event because we want to bring guys together and inspire some hope that we're going to assure you guys with this education, what you need to be asking primary therapists in order to, when you go petition for your release, these are the issues that need to be brought forward. And it gets super complicated, and I want to try to keep it as simple as I can when I explain this right now, is that our primary therapist, our clinical team, is supposed to be telling us what we need to work on. They're supposed to be identifying what behaviors we're exhibiting that are associated with these disorders, with the risk that they're staying. We belong in this high security because we pose this risk to society. But from my experience, and I've been here 15 years and I've watched this entire population, it's very rare that I see individuals exhibit any disorders or any behaviors that are associated with these disorders that they've been given. And if people read the peer reviews, I can't remember the taxonomy by Richard Buller and Alan Francis. It's a peer review, and I believe it's online. If people read this and get an understanding of how these civil commitment facilities are misusing these disorders that are in the DSM-5 and the previous DSMs, we'll get an understanding of how we need to start attacking this issue, attacking these clinical and these forensic examiners that are assigning these disorders. Since we've done this education of the population, we've seen guys being progressed through the program more rapidly than I've ever experienced before. One of the big things that came out of this is after we held this event, we used to have community meetings every Wednesday. And after that event, the next week we had a community meeting, and the entire unit raised issue about their diagnosis. And if we had these severe disorders, how come nobody's telling me when I'm exhibiting behaviors associated with them? And these are the reasons why we're locked up. So right after that, we brought this issue up twice in our community meetings, and they completely shut down our community meetings. Clinical pulled back from talking with guys about their diagnosis. They start telling guys, we're not going to talk about your diagnosis, we're not going to talk about risk. And these are the reasons why we're here. These are the things we're supposed to be treated for, but the clinical didn't want to talk about it. Now, we got off lockdown and were able to socialize with the rest of the population. And we took what we educated the guys on 1E with and started sharing with the population. And it went from that to doing the protests and to the assemblies and trying to educate the entire population on what questions we need to be asking our clinical, what questions we need to be asking these forensic examiners when we petition for our releases. And it sounds super complicated because it takes really studying the DSM-5, studying these peer-reviewed journals that are done by experts in this field. But I think it's really necessary if we're going to really challenge civil commitment nationally with the 20 states that have it, and start.
You have 1 minute remaining.
Start addressing the medical malpractice that's going on within these facilities. I don't know if there's anything more that Daniel wanted to speak on, but I really appreciate everyone who's participating today, and thank you all.
Daniel, any last words?
Russ, do you want to call back, or do you?
Any last words, Daniel?
You'll call back. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't catch everything Russ said, but
You have 1 minute remaining.
thank you for putting up with that. This automated system. But I didn't hear everything Russ said, but I had an idea of what he said. And like I said, I can't say enough good about him and everything that he's contributed to this. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If there's one thing that I would tell everyone, it's, the guys that are committed have to focus on their diagnosis. This whole thing is about mental illness, and it's a sham, and it's very easy to see it when a person does their research. So that's really the gist of it. When we start seeing what's really going on, there's some serious malpractice, and anyone that can read can see it. So it just takes a little study, and we're not mentally ill. It's all political, and we just need to keep creating awareness about it. So thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate you.
Okay, Daniel.
So is
Talk to you later.
Daniel going to call,
Yeah.
call back to answer questions or?
I don't know if he is or not.
Okay.
He didn't say.
Well, Russ is calling back, so we can have Q&A kind of time, and if there are questions addressed to Russ, we'll direct them at him. But for now, he can just sort of listen in. So I think now would be a great time to open it up to
Hey,
questions
Trevor,
and
I
discussion.
got questions from our live stream. From Lorraine, is my understanding that the civil commitment facilities are owned by, and operated by private companies
Russ.
and not run by any government? Is this true? Who runs civil commitment? Who enforces this? Do lawmakers know what is going on with all this?
I heard 50% of that because I was answering the phone. Who runs
Yeah,
these
who
programs?
runs civil commitment? Like, is it owned and operated? Is the government running it?
Yep, it's a state-run facilities. In Florida, there is a private civil commitment facility, so it's run by GEO Group, which runs private prisons. Most of them are not privately run facilities, so usually run by, Department of Health and what are the names of these departments? Anyways, the sort of mental health, charge state agencies, in coordination with the prisons and state attorneys. State attorneys are the ones that file the petitions. It's like, I mean, the civil is the unusual word here, right? Because it's like, what is civil about this process? It's because it's under the civil law, and so you don't have a lot of the due process rights that you would under the criminal law. So all those kinds of like the idea that anything you tell your therapist is usually protected. Well, it's not true here because it's under the civil law. Hearsay can be admitted in court. So it's done under civil state law. State attorneys file the petitions, and then the facilities are run usually by the state. In Florida, they have a privately run facility, but it's not a federally coordinated system, right? It's at the state level.
All right, can you hear me? Okay. Have you had any interaction with any lawmakers concerning all this? This is the second part of that question.
Daniel, any lawmakers?
All right, you're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there's one House representative in Minnesota that we've worked pretty close with lately. And we've gotten to speak with a couple others, but there's one in particular, and I'll say his name because he's made it public, Steve Sandell, representative here in Minnesota, and he's made it very clear that not only is MSOP immoral and ineffective, but right now could be operating illegally, even under the current statutes. The way that they're operating the facility, and it gets kind of technical. They have some illegal variances in place that are just blatantly against the statute. But without boring you about that, the simple answer is yes. Mr. Sandell is very concerned and working pretty hard to try to make some changes. But he's kind of up against a lot of other issues. Of course, there's plenty going on in our country that's very serious. So, to even try to create awareness around this while COVID is going on and Black Lives Matter and now the gun issues, it's an uphill battle, and all these things are very important. So, but yes, there's a couple that are paying attention.
Personal issue for me is I have several friends in South Carolina who are civilly committed. I'm still in touch with them. They switched from state to private, and the supposition among the inmates, residents there, is that there's an incentive for the private company to keep people there because they continue to get money there. Have you come across anything like that in your work?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was just looking at a trial transcript in Florida where the person who works at that facility, I was just talking about this at lunch, says in as many words that they have kind of a fiduciary responsibility to keep people in this facility, right there in the open. And so it's, yes, definitely there is a profit motive, right? They have shareholders, GEO Group. I don't know who runs South Carolina's facility, but but Florida's GEO Group, they're a massive private prison company. Yeah, I mean, there's other motives other than just, you know, the medical, I mean, quasi-medical aspects of these facilities.
Okay, again from the live stream from Michael. Indiana does not have civil commitment, but has instituted lifetime parole, a revolving door back to prison. Have you done any research into these alternatives to civil incarceration that actually fulfill the same role?
It's a great question because it's like, you know, stepping back from the specifics of that question, I think about this a lot. Is how specific to this deep kind of intense modes of punishment is it to sex offenses? And is it about sex necessarily? And I was just talking about this at lunch again. I think oftentimes back to the drug war, 3 strikes laws, and that sort of super predator discourse. Also kind of implemented this lifetime imprisonment, throw away the key model. And so in my head, I just think about that it can bleed over to other areas. It's not just about sex, although the specifics are unique, and I don't think we'll see civil commitment bleed over in other areas, but absolutely there can be other forms of punishment that look an awful lot like this, because civil commitment looks an awful lot like other kinds of bad forms of punishment. So, you know, fixing this one issue, you know, quote unquote, if we were to abolish civil commitment, there will certainly be other approaches that will resemble it in some way, and so I do think, you know, we have to have a multi-pronged, obviously, vision of what reform would look. Speaking, you know, as a sociologist, not necessarily always in the reform thing, just thinking in the big picture. There are absolutely other approaches that look an awful lot like this. The difference primarily, as I said, is the civil law. All those kind of due process protections are used to under the criminal law. A lot of them evaporate. So it's a lot harder to get out from under, even as obviously 3 strikes laws, it was obviously hard to get out from under those policies too. But lifetime parole I haven't heard about, but that sounds like it could be similar.
Can I speak to that?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Professor Hoppe makes a great point, and to just repeat, I believe Mr. Doggett already said it, but to make it clear, a person in Minnesota, at least, and I believe there's at least 4 or 5 other states, you do not need a criminal conviction of any kind to get civilly committed and stay civilly committed for the rest of your life. In Minnesota, you need 2 allegations of emotional harm that is sexual in nature. So catcalling a woman from a construction site on 2 occasions could legally justify commitment. That's very unlikely, but what I'm saying is on paper, in the statute, that's totally feasible. It's legal. Whereas I believe in Wisconsin is a good example of, I believe there you have to have a criminal conviction, specifically a sex offense. That's not the case in Minnesota. You also don't get a jury trial. So I think it's a similar example of what Professor Hoppe was just explaining, that these things can leak into other areas, but you don't actually need any kind of criminal conviction. And Mr. Doggett explained earlier, there's a gentleman here who's been here 45 years, and he got committed when he was 15. He has no criminal convictions. There was 2 allegations that he had done something sexually harmful, but they were never proven. He was never brought to criminal court, never found guilty. In the eyes of the law, he's an innocent man, innocent until proven guilty, but he's now civilly committed. He's 60 years old, so he's been here 45 years. And he's not even in phase 2. He's been in treatment that whole time. He's not even in the 2nd phase of the program. They just find every excuse they can to keep him back. It's really mind-blowing. It's just hard to even talk about it. But he's not the only one, but he's a good example of many guys who are like that.
Daniel, let me ask you a question. A gentleman asked a question. Is any special funding they get in Minnesota to keep you there longer for any reason?
So are you asking is there a motivation to keep us longer? Do they get more funding?
Yes, correct.
For that? Just having us housed in general, it's hard to follow the money here. There's been a lot of us have tried to really dig into that. They take 50% of any income that we get, and there's a lot of suspicion about where it goes. It's hard to get, documentation or any kind of public information about that. The highest paid employee gets upwards of $400,000 a year. They make over $100 an hour, and the top 4 highest paid employees together make about $600,000 a year. So there's definitely, some people that are, benefiting financially from this. And that's really seems to be the only justification for it. If we could put a big dent in sexual violence in Minnesota, I would have nothing to complain about, even if I am stuck here. And they could spend all the money they want, and I would keep my mouth shut. But until they can show me that, or anyone, that they're actually making a difference, I don't see that it's justified.
Okay, we have a few more questions.
Hi, my name is Amber Valangas, and I'm with Restorative Action Alliance, and we are currently working with a group that is inside the facility in Marcy, New York. We've just recently started working with them. And my question is Ocean in contact with other facilities, and are you doing any work with the Marcy group?
You hear that, Daniel?
Yeah, I like her. I could hear her. She spoke up. Thank you.
My Twitter handle is Amber Speaks Up.
Yes, I know Mr. Coulter
Yes.
from Marcy, and I know a couple others. I think Conrad Murphy is from New York. And I have communication with about 170 gentlemen in every state that has civil commitment. Some more than others. Some states I might know 2 guys, and then in South Carolina I know like 20. So yes, but it's very difficult to stay in communication. As soon as they find out why I write to the men that are confined there, or they find out who I am, sometimes I have a hard time getting mail to and from. That's why we have a P.O. box as a separate way to communicate. But yeah, we're trying to find ways to organize with other facilities, and that's really what we intended this to be. We're hoping that everyone listening can learn something and kind of share it with. If you know somebody that's committed, you can share it with them and try to motivate some of our peers, because the hopelessness runs real deep. It's very, very thick. It's very difficult to inspire or encourage each other. If they get it from their support outside the fence, they may be more inclined to try to do something. So, yeah, we try to organize with others when we can.
Okay, let's see if there's any more questions.
Okay. Hi, I'm John Gorley from Michigan. My question is about the certification that the therapists have that do this, and whether there's been any attempt to get the agencies or the professional associations to withdraw the certification from these therapists who are clearly not doing any good.
You hear that, Daniel?
I could not hear that as well.
He's talking about certifications. What certifications do they have? And as far as removing them if they're not doing their duty and ethical standards to evaluate you and assess you, and anyway, certifications of the employees.
That's a great question. I don't know if many of you have heard about the Karstens case, but it's a case that was filed in 2011, and it went on for 10 years, now being appealed. We won and then we lost. It's a long story, but in that case, we learned a lot about the accreditations of MSOP, or the lack thereof. They have no accreditations. They're not accredited by any hospital boards of any kind or anything. And the reason is, in 2008, they changed from a medical model program to a psychoeducational program. Psychoeducational is exactly what they teach in prison. So, and the biggest problem with that is they locked us up under the pretext that we're mentally ill, which, fine, that's what they want to claim. It's not true for 90% of us. But then they change it from a medical model to psychoeducational. They basically pulled the rug out from under everyone, and now everybody's learning stuff that wouldn't apply to them if they did have a mental illness. So it's a big mess, but there's no accreditation. The way that they changed the model, they did it by using what's called variances. And these variances follow very strict statutory guidelines that they're breaking.
You have 1 minute remaining.
For instance, they can't have new staff in here that are not qualified, which is exactly what they did. They switched out the staff. To keep it simple, it's no longer a hospital, and they're not serving a mentally ill population, and they know that, which entitles 99% of us to release.
And I'll just add to that briefly that I'm not an expert on that question, but I have a colleague, Stefan Vogler, who has a book out called Sorting Sexualities, which talks about the fight in modern psychiatry between forensic psychiatry, which is sort of globbed onto these cases. They charge about $5,000 to evaluate each case, and then potentially more as the case proceeds. And then mainstream psychiatry, which has been vigorously opposed to civil commitment since the 90s. So I would definitely recommend looking at that book, Stefan Vogler, Sorting Sexualities, because he's kind of as far as I know, the expert on that question. Thank you guys so much for this coming out. I think he's got some pamphlets and copies of the PowerPoint.
If anybody will,
if you're
yes.
interested.